Aloha, I'm John David End, Professor of History at HPU. And this lecture is on economic history, the economic history of World War I, the post-war period, and then into the Great Depression in the 1930s. And this is a really, for me, it's very fascinating, but there are quite a few numbers. So, the numbers are important, but don't get hung up on them. You're not going to remember all of them. The important thing is just to keep in mind that narrative line that kind of pulls all the numbers together. There's some important themes here that lead us into World War II. So let's get started. Okay, at the outset of World War I, you have some very interesting, kind of, in a way, unexpected things happening. Even though the United States is the largest economy in the world, it's actually France and especially Great Britain, Paris and London, which are the centers of capital. These are the places where the big banks loan out lots of money to the rest of the world. The United States, before the war, is still secondary to the great centers of capital in Europe. And so you would think, okay, this makes them very powerful, but what happens is after World War I, these great centers of capital become great debtors. They lose their capital and they owe a lot of their debt to the United States. So it's the United States that comes out on top. And this deeply influences the post-war period, and then, of course, the direction of things up into the Great Depression in the early 1930s. So let's talk about gold. So before World War I, all of the major economies were on the gold standard. And the reason for this is there was a belief among economists and central bankers and political leaders, most political leaders, that the gold standard was the most stable standard for economies. So the gold standard means that you match your gold reserves to a certain ratio of paper money, and then you cannot print beyond that paper ratio of money. And so it limited the amount of capital available, and it made interest rates high. And it really favored, it was probably more stable than the silver standard, for instance, because there was more silver in circulation, more silver being mined. And so the silver was kind of more capital, but maybe a little less stable. But really, the truth is that the gold standard favored bankers and economic elites, wealthy people, and political leaders. For instance, workers or peasants, they didn't have access to capital because capital was expensive. Interest rates were high, so they normally couldn't make the kind of loans that you needed to become more wealthy, to invest and buy property and the rest of it. So it's kind of a rich man's world before World War I, a rich man's economy. Now, in terms of the gold reserves, the United States has the most, with 2 billion in gold reserves. Great Britain actually has the least, with about 200 million. The French have about 800 million in gold reserves, and Germany about 500 million in gold reserves. So the Americans are definitely in an advantageous position in terms of gold. Now, the war breaks out. It's assumed it's going to be a short war, and it'll be not necessarily an expensive war at all. But it turns out to be a long war, 4 years, and an incredibly expensive war, $200 billion expensive war. The British spend 43 billion, the Germans spend 47 billion, the French less than that, and then the Americans a smaller amount. And so the big issue here financially is, how do you pay for this? These enormous expenses. And so that's the challenge, that's quite frankly, and for the European powers. And so each group, each nation has a little different way of doing this. In the United States, most of the war debt is funded through Liberty bonds. $20 billion is raised in Liberty bonds. So the United States doesn't have to go deeply into debt, borrowing money from outside to actually pay for the war. In fact, there's so much capital in the United States that the United States becomes the creditor to both the French and the British, who actually have to borrow money from the United States in order to fight the war. The British borrow about 5 million, the French about 4 billion. Overall, the war debts are about $11 billion total, and this becomes a big issue after the war. Okay, so the British, they borrow money from the U.S., they raise taxes, they have a smaller bond campaign, but they also have to print more money. And pardon me, so they actually have to increase their money supply by about double. And because their gold supply does not increase, that means that they have inflation. And that means they have to go off the gold standard. And the French, about 3 times the amount of money. And then the Germans, about 4 times the amount of money. The Germans are in the most trouble because they have a difficult time raising funds otherwise. So essentially, they're funding the war by printing money. And inflation goes up about 40% annually in Germany for the course of the war. So we'll revisit that because this inflation issue is quite important in the post-war period. But so all the other 3 economies go off the gold standard. So then the war ends, of course, and you have as I've talked about in the previous lecture, you have this big reparations bill that the Germans have to pay. And they're already printing too much money, so that's just going to get worse and worse for them. The British are in a situation where they want to get back on the gold standard, and in order to do this, they have to deflate their economy to get the value of their currency back up to the point where it matches the amount of gold they have in, which is diminished a little bit because what happens is some of the payments that were made to the United States were made in gold. And so the United States gold actually increases, it doubles from 2 billion to 4 billion at the end of World War I. And the French are kind of in a middle position, reparations and war debts become really crucial at the end of World War I. The Germans have this big reparations they have to pay to the French and the British. The French and the British have this big war debt that they have to pay to the Americans. And what the French and the British both do is they link their payments of war debts to the money they get in terms of German reparations. So if they don't get German reparations, they're not going to make payments on their debts. And this, of course, enrages American policymakers. But it's just what they've set up. So one of the things that happens is negotiations over the war debts ensues. And so the Americans realize in order to settle this thing, in order to create a stable financial system in post-war Europe, then you have to give a little bit. And so the Americans did. They renegotiated war debts at an 80% rate for the British, at a 40% rate for the French, and a 24% rate for the Italians. The Italians really got a good deal. They only paid a quarter of their war debt. Okay, so the other thing that happens here is the German economy is spinning out of control. In 1923, German inflation reaches all-time new heights. It takes, it's 1 billion Reichsmarks to buy a cup of coffee. A week's pay has to be delivered in a wheelbarrow. You need so many of these Reichsmarks bills. And it's used for burning in their stoves at home to keep warm. It's so worthless. So the German economy is spinning down with this hyperinflation. And what's interesting is that at this point in time, then there's an important individual. His name is Hjalmar Schacht, who steps into the position of the president of the Reichsbank, which is the German central bank. And he develops a kind of radical policy to solve this crisis. He says, and this was not his idea. He took somebody else's idea and he ran with it. So basically he said, what we need to do is we need a new currency. Get rid of the Reichsmarks, and the new currency is going to be the Rentenmark. And the Rentenmark is going to be based not on gold, but it's going to be based on property. We're going to have a limited print run. I think it was like 5 billion Rentenmarks. And the Rentenmark is going to be pegged to one Rentenmark to 1 trillion Reichsmarks. Yeah, that 1 trillion Reichsmarks. So if you hold a lot of debt in Reichsmarks, you're loving this, because you can pay off all that debt with just a few Rentenmarks. So the German government actually becomes solvent overnight because it can pay off its debts in Rentenmarks. Let's say if you saved your money in the last 10 years and you've got a lot of Reichsmarks in the banks, it's worthless now. And you may as well use it in your stove because it's worth absolutely nothing. So it hurts people who save, but it does save the German economy for the time being. For the next 5 years, then the German economy begins to recover. Now, because they've defaulted on their reparations payments in 1923, then the Americans step forward with a plan. They recognize that this is untenable. This chaos is unsustainable. And so the Americans give the Germans a $200 million loan, and that goes up to $2 billion by the end of the decade. And with the $200 billion loan, then Germany uses that money to pay the French and the British their reparations, and then the French and the British pay make their debt payment. And so the money just goes in a circle. It jumps from the Americans to the Germans to the French and the British and back to the Americans. Now, this shell game is actually not sustainable either. In the short run, it's sustainable, but it takes American capital to make this whole game work. And of course, when the stock market crashes and the Great Depression hits, then that capital disappears. The whole thing falls apart. And what happens then is economies go their own way. And we see a decade of economic nationalism. Okay, so conference, they lower, led by a guy named Charles Dawes, who is an American industrialist, financier actually. And Dawes gets an agreement to lower the reparations amount and then to basically say, hey, the Germans pay whatever they can. And so this works. Again, it works for a while, but it doesn't work over the long haul. Now, the United States economy, in contrast to Europe, which is struggling, and the British, in their attempts to get back on the gold standard, pushed their economy into a 10-year recession that ends in the Great Depression. 10% unemployment, people with very little money. And they eventually do get back on the gold standard in 1927, but the price of it is impoverishing, most of their population. It's kind of crazy. The one person who really understands all of this and was very critical of the British approach is John Maynard Keynes. Keynes says, let's get rid of the gold standard. We don't need it. He understands that in reality, in the post-war period, Europe and the United States are already on what he calls a dollar standard because of the dominance of the American economy. Okay, so in the United States, there's prosperity. It's the economy is going, and there actually is a stock market bubble. So in 1929, the stock market is going up and up, but most people recognize by this point that the stock market valuations are too high, that this could result in a real crash. And so, people start to pull their money out of the stock market. Stock market starts to get really volatile. It goes up and then it goes down and up and down. And then in October 1929, it crashes. And even really rich people lose their money in this stock market crash. For instance, Will Durant, who founded General Motors Corporation and was worth about $15 million at this point. He puts all of his money into the stock market to try to save it in October 1929, and he loses all of it. He dies a poor man running a pool hall back in Flint, Michigan. So this is quite a powerful economic event. Stock market crashes. The American central bank makes all the wrong decisions by raising interest rates, so that cuts off capital. And then the economic kind of shock of the stock market crashing then leads to the Great Depression. In part, it leads to the Great Depression because you have a phenomenon called a run on the banks. And this is what happens in the United States in 1930. Americans, seeing that the economy is in trouble, they run to the bank and they get their money out of the bank. But if enough people do that, then the bank runs out of money, and those who are at the back of the line, they don't get anything. This is a time period before the United States had a federal insurance on bank deposits, which they have today, which basically eliminated bank runs. But in this time period, in 1930 and then again in 1933, bank runs were endemic. They were really common, and they really hurt the American economy. Okay, so the Great Depression is global. It hits everybody, all of the major economies. I mean, the United States, 1932, 25% unemployment, a 50% drop in industrial production, trade is dropping by 2/3. The economy is just shrinking. And of course, what's needed is more investment. And eventually, the United States, under the new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, does this. They put money into the economy, and it does stimulate the economy. Roosevelt makes a mistake in 1936 because he runs on a platform of balancing the national budget, and then does it in wins a landslide, and then does this, and he starts taking money out of the economy. The American economy slides back into what we call the Roosevelt recession in 1937, and this delays the recovery from the Great Depression by a couple of years. The British struggle. The two nations that don't struggle, Japan and Germany. Well, Germany struggles early on. In 1932, their unemployment is 32%. Their economy is actually in far worse shape than the American economy. And that's part of why Hitler gets elected, because people are so unhappy with the status quo, and Hitler promises jobs for everyone. He has an economic platform that he runs on. And then, of course, once he gets into power, then he says, forget about it, I'm a dictator, and ends the legislature and rules as a dictator until he dies in 1945. The Japanese suffer as well in the early 1930s, but they pursue an inflationary policy, and so by 1935, their economy is actually booming. They have a lot of trade within Asia, within Northeast Asia, and they're still trading actually at very high levels with the United States. And then Germany under Hitler, economy starts to grow again because Hitler makes big investments in military and in public works like the Autobahn, for instance. And so this money that's pushed into the German economy helps the economy to recover. But this is a recovery that will lead to war because Germany is investing in the military and in arms. Japan is doing the same thing. They've invaded China and they're investing in that invasion. And so these two nations recover by militarizing and by expanding their territory through military conquest. This is, of course, a very dangerous form of recovery that actually leads to World War II. And so that's really the takeaway, is that the United States economy takes a long time to recover, but it's really the German and the Japanese economies that recover early because they invest in the military, and then this helps to lead to war. Okay, we're going to stop there. Have a great day. Bye-bye.